I'm getting a tattoo to celebrate reaching 30,000 subscribers, and I'm taking you with me. People have been ornamenting, decorating, and altering their bodies for tens of thousands of years. This self-expression has been, and still is, present in all cultures around the world. While some types of this decoration are removable or changeable, like jewelry or clothing, sometimes you want something to be a little bit more permanent. Maybe you want something that represents the cultural group that you belong to or your profession. Maybe it's a significant symbol that brings you power. Or maybe it's someone else that put it on you to make sure that the world knows who you are or what you did. That's right, we are finally diving into the archaeology of tattooing. I spoke with prehistoric archaeologist Aaron Dieter Wolf, one of the editors of this amazing book here called Ancient Ink, The Archaeology of Tattooing, and also one of the faces behind the super cool Instagram account Archaeology Inc. to get the lowdown on ancient tattooing and the evidence that we have in the archaeological record. And I'm taking you with me to get a tattoo that I have wanted for over 10 years now, all because you guys decided to hit that subscribe button over 30,000 times. That's a really big, scary number, actually. It's a little overwhelming, but I am so thankful to you guys for that. So without further ado, let's get into it. And just a quick PSA, this video will contain images of human remains, so if you do not want to see images of human remains, now's the time to move on. But I still love you. Thank you so much for 30K. In general, how many examples do we have throughout the world of tattooed human remains?
It's hard to say for certain. A lot of the reports of tattooed human remains are just done in passing, and we don't know if they're talking about single individuals or whole populations. And then sometimes you have the reverse. Sometimes you'll have someone who says something in writing like, 70% of this single valley in South America was tattooed. You're like, okay, where's the raw data on that? And, so it's really hard to come up with exact numbers. I think at last count, it's around 55, 65, 75, somewhere in there sites globally. And I just recently came up with that visual interface to the tattooed human mummies database. And so it's now a global map. Using ArcGIS that people can click through to each of the different sites and actually find links about the information to each of those finds then. And sometimes there's not even pictures of them. Sometimes you just have these references that there were 3 people at this one site, but there's no imagery. The reports either aren't in English or just simply don't exist at some point or aren't accessible on the internet. And we deal with this, right? And sort of a new emerging way then is also museum collections. Going back to the 18th and 19th centuries, tattooed human remains, particularly from South America, were collected by a lot of travelers and institutions. A lot of them, most of them probably don't have provenience information, or if they do, they're just to general site rather than, era or location on the site or level within the site. And some colleagues and I have been working with these collections recently, trying to get access to them and document them. And that's been a really interesting process, both figuring out how many of those that are out there, but also then working through the issues of studying human remains in the contemporary archaeological paradigm. There are institutions that have decided that human remains are no longer available to work with, period. And then there are others who, will make you an appointment this afternoon and be glad that you came in and did the research. And so it varies widely as to what we can access and fully document.
The oldest evidence we have of preserved tattoos on human skin is from 5,200 years ago on Ötzi the Iceman, who lived during the Copper Age sometime between 3350 and 3100 BCE. Ötzi was discovered by hikers in 1991 in the Ötztal Alps along the border between Austria and Italy. Otzi has a total of 61 tattoos scattered across his back, legs, arms, and chest. Most of them are clusters of lines, apart from crosses that are located on the back of his right knee and his right ankle. Radiological examination of Ötzi shows that many of his tattooed areas corresponded to parts of his body that were not the healthiest, let's say, and these would have caused him pain or limited his movements. This suggests that these tattoos that he had may have been therapeutic in nature. For example, they could have been done to help with pain relief in a process similar to acupressure or acupuncture, which is super cool because Ötzi lived at least 2,000 years before the earliest known use of these treatments in China. Before Ötzi was declared the oldest known person to have tattoos, the mummified remains of a man belonging to the South American Chinchorro culture who had a thin moustache-type tattoo on his upper lip was another candidate for this top spot. The Chinchorro culture was a fishing society that existed before the invention of pottery in what is today the coastal regions of Chile and southern Peru between around 7000 and 1100 BCE. The Chinchorro people also practiced deliberate mummification very early on. There are two types of mummification, natural and deliberate, and they actually can happen at the same time, at the same place, but in general, they have kind of happened all over the world, and the Chinchorro people are actually the oldest known human mummies to date. Take that, Egypt. But what happened with the Chinchorro tattoo was that the radiocarbon dates were misread and they caused some confusion, and it does turn out that Ötzi is about 500 years older than our fine mustachioed friend here from South America.
Where do you think it actually started? Like, yeah, that's the earliest evidence we have, but doesn't mean that's where it started. So where do you think is the best evidence we have for that in history?
I don't know that we do, right? I think the Venus of Hofels is the earliest data point we can point to and say potentially tattooed person in the upper Paleolithic in Europe. That doesn't mean it's how old it is. It doesn't mean it's where it started. I strongly suspect that patterns of tattooing and scarification probably originated much deeper in human history in Africa. We have rock art in Africa that shows keloid scarification going back 9,000 or 10,000 years, I think. Yeah, I think that, anything you can do permanently to the skin is better doing it permanently than temporarily, right? If it has cultural significance, you want to do it the best way possible, the most sustainable or sustaining way possible. And so, yeah, I think tattooing is much earlier than that. Proving it would be difficult, but that's what we have at this point, yeah.
Speaking of ancient Egypt, they also had tattooing. Thanks to modern imaging, we've been able to identify what we once thought of as just a small green smudge on the upper right arm of the Gobelin man, which is the mummified human remains of a young man from ancient Egypt found in the 1890s and dating to around 3500 BCE as two horned animals, which appeared to be a bull and a Barbary sheep. A woman found at the same site was also found to have tattoos on her. She had 4 S shapes on her right shoulder that are very similar to pre-dynastic pottery motifs, and she also had a crooked line on her right arm that some researchers think could actually represent a ceremonial staff or a clapper that was used in ceremonial activities. Actually, from what evidence we do have, more women than men were tattooed in ancient Egypt. And before the Gobelin man's tattoos were discovered, we used to think the practice was exclusively for women. This, of course, led the mostly male excavators from the late 19th and early 20th centuries to say that these women were of questionable morals and were sometimes described as dancing girls or concubines, which is just a lot of like, I just get the ick. I get the ick when I'm talking about how people used to just put these blanket interpretations over people due to their own biases and not thinking about it. And this was also sort of helped by the misinterpretation of a title that was given to a tattooed priestess of Hathor who was named Amunet, and her title actually translated to chief lady in waiting and not like a concubine, essentially. Tattoos on ancient Egyptian women were mainly geometrical groupings of dots and dashes located on the chest, abdomen, arms, and legs. Now, while some believe these tattoos were to identify women of the night and protect them from sexually transmitted diseases, it actually seems that many of these tattoos were linked to the worship of the goddess Hathor, especially the ones found at Deir el-Medina, where one woman was found with Nefer signs, eyes of Horus, bent lotus flowers, and cows wearing Hathor necklaces on her. Other tattoos that ancient Egyptian women had could have played a therapeutic role and functioned as an amulet for pregnancy. The lines across women's abdomens have been interpreted as nets that would have expanded during pregnancy, like the beaded nets that were placed over ancient Egyptian mummies to hold everything in place. And Bes was also sometimes tattooed on the tops of women's thighs. Bes was the protector of women in labor, so it was a good position to protect both mother and baby during childbirth.
The really interesting thing to me is that pretty much every place on Earth where there are preserved human remains, there are preserved tattoos. Wow. And, keeping in mind that that's still a pretty limited sample of this, this huge geographic area that humanity has covered. But I still think that's pretty telling about, how universal and how deeply rooted body decoration is in the human psyche.
As Aaron said, wherever you find people, you find evidence of tattooing. We see it in the mummified remains of the Abaloy culture from Benguet in the Philippines around 1500 CE. They tattooed animals onto their bodies, such as lizards, snakes, and scorpions, after they successfully took the head of an enemy in battle. Some also had zigzagging lines that have been interpreted as representing either lightning or the stepped rice fields that would have surrounded the landscape that they lived in. The Lady of Cow from the Moche culture in Peru, dating to around 450 CE, had tattoos of stylized catfish, spiders, crabs, snakes, feline creatures, and a supernatural being on her. These could have been purely aesthetic or have actually played a role in transformation into a new state of being. And indigenous cultures in the southeastern ceremonial complex in North America use tattoos in a religious way, with facial tattoos capturing the soul of someone they killed in battle to extend their lives and to ease the passing of their ancestors. Bird motifs were really popular and seemed to relate to a deity called the Birdman, who symbolized the triumph of life over death. By tattooing themselves with these images, they became that supernatural creature and were able to embody that spiritual force. Some of the most famous and well-known examples of ancient tattoos come from the Pazyryk mummies found in the Altai Mountains of Siberia and dating to the 3rd and 4th centuries BCE. These people, such as the Altai Princess or the Ice Maiden as she's popularly called, are covered in these fantastically intricate and dynamic tattoos depicting both real and mythological or composite animals. They're either alone, in fight scenes, or in processions as well, so there's a lot of variation into how they're depicted. The most common one is a mythological creature with the body and head of a wild goat, an eagle's beak, and a panther's tail that appears on the upper right shoulder of most of the human remains that have been found. The people who had these tattoos appear to have been part of the nomadic elite, and these tattoos probably signaled their belonging to the ruling clans and families or associated them with mythological power or symbolic totem animals.
What other techniques do you use, let's say on human remains, that can identify tattoos? Because I know especially mummified skin in Egypt really darkens. And there was evidence of, I think, the Ghibelline man and the other mummies that were found with him. No one noticed for 100 years or more?
100 years on display for 100 years and nobody noticed?
Yeah. How did they, what sort of imaging can you use for that?
Infrared and full spectrum are really the ways to go, right? Mm-hmm. And the reason that works is because pigments, whatever the pigment is, absorbs infrared light or light from the spectrum in a different way than the surrounding untattooed skin. And so, with that full spectrum or with that infrared illumination, it doesn't always, but it can make the tattoos stand out. And, there's some great examples of how far this can go. I mean, it was, 2015 or 2016, the most recent publication on Ötzi's tattoos, where they actually found a new group that's completely invisible to the naked eye and is actually underneath a flap of skin that was folded over. But using these techniques, they were able to, extrapolate that. Same thing for the woman from, was it Sudan, who has the medieval Sudan, who has the tattoo on her thigh?
Oh, it's the thigh one, yeah.
Yeah, it's like the inner thigh. She has like the Archangel Michael symbol or something like this. And I think that was identified without even her mummy being unwrapped, just using, these imaging techniques, to the same ones that they use basically to be able to see through the outer coffin and the wrappings and all of that, and they came up with this image of a tattoo. So we've started recently using D-Stretch, which is a program written to reveal faint rock art. But it doesn't use different ends of the spectrum. Instead, it's an image decorrelation. So it basically takes a digital image and breaks apart the pixels and sort of reassembles them into color spaces based on an algorithm that aligns like colors together. And so if you have, fugitive colors in the rock art record, say like a pale pink or a red that might fade into the background and be virtually invisible, well, you can now see what those things are. They're in a completely different color space. They look wacky, right? They look almost psychedelic from time to time. But it's a different way of imaging them, and you can sort of get a different view on what those colors are than you can just with infrared.
The ancient Greeks also depicted Thracian women with tattoos, sometimes covering their entire bodies. These tattoos consisted of line work, wavy patterns and zigzags, animals, dots, and rosettes. According to Herodotus and another Greek writer called Dio Chrysostom, the tattoos were a sign of noble birth for the Thracians. In fact, the more you had and the more elaborate the design, the higher status you and your family were. The Greeks found this act so interesting because they, like many other cultures such as the Persians, mostly used tattoos as a form of punishment. If you had a tattoo in ancient Greece, you were either a slave, had committed a heinous crime, or were just not Greek, a barbarian, as the ancient Greeks used to say. There's a really interesting story from Plutarch about how when the Athenians defeated the Samians in a naval battle, they tattooed the Athenian owl on the foreheads of the Samians. And later, when the Samians defeated the Athenians in another battle, the Samians tattooed a Samian warship onto the Athenians. Talk about an eye for an eye, eh?
Essentially, I feel like it's something similar to pottery, building a pyramid, things like that. They've all sort of become an autonomous practice that's all been developed independently throughout the world.
Yeah. Well, I think, and that's a really good idea. Well, I think that sort of cuts to the meat of it, right? Is it fire or is it pottery, right? Is it something that was developed in Africa by some of the earliest hominin ancestors or by the early humans and then just fused with them, along with, bows and arrows and stone tool making and things like this? Or is it something like pottery that was independently invented all over the earth at different times? And in some cases, there's enough similarity in the tools that we can see patterns of diffusion instead of independent invention. But at the global scale, we still don't have that. We're still not able to quite, nail down the precise path of tattooing across the human landscape.
Now, even though we have a number of examples of preserved tattooed human skin from around the world, we know that organic materials like our bodies rarely survive for hundreds or thousands of years. So how else does evidence of tattooing appear in the archaeological record? In the tools, of course. They didn't have the tattoo guns that we have today, but there are a few methods and tools that wouldn't look so out of place in the modern world, especially among the stick and poke community.
How does the evidence for tattooing appear in the archaeological record?
Well, people going back, archaeologists going back a century or more, have been occasionally pulling things out of the archaeological record and saying, this was probably a tattooing tool. And those things are almost always pointy, right? They're sharp. Sometimes they have pigment association, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they're just unusual within the site assemblage. So they're artifacts that stand out as being different from your, quote unquote, utilitarian goods. But one of the things I've really been working hard on this last 10, 15 years now is trying to nail this down in a better way using archaeological science, right? So, when we pull artifacts out of the archaeological record and say, this is a whatever, we're biasing that record. We're imposing our own views on that piece of human history. And it's possible, or maybe even likely, that the people that made and used an artifact didn't see it that way at all. And so, one of my good friends has this thing he says that a screwdriver is the perfect tool for opening a can of paint. And so if you found a screwdriver in the archaeological record, it would be totally reasonable for you to pick it up and say, this is a paint opener. Oh, but once you've called it that and put it into the museum collection and labeled it that way and put it in the site report, it will never be anything other than a paint opener. And you've lost the original purpose for which that artifact was made. And so that's really sort of been my drive with tattooing tools, is this idea that, we can do better than it just being pointy. We can come up with patterns of association or context that suggest things might, in fact, be for tattooing rather than for another purpose. The big one there is pigment associations, or association with other artifacts for processing or applying pigments. The setting is a big one, right? For most cultures around the world, tattooing was not something that was just done casually around the site. It was something that was done by specific people in specific settings for specific reasons. And so, that carries through to the location where these artifacts might be deposited. And then the other one is things like then use wear, micro wear patterns and things like that, where we can actually then, with some reasonable success, say that a tool was used to shallowly pierce the skin instead of decorating pottery or working hides or something like that.
Are there specific wear patterns where you can actually tell that it was used to pierce, like living flesh versus, like a dried hide? Like, what would that difference be in the wear?
It's very, very slight.
Okay.
So, in sort of our history of looking at this thing, and my history of looking at this thing, that's one of the things we've done is experimental archaeology, is recreating and testing tools for exactly that reason, to see, what is the wear signature from tattooing versus what is the wear signature from leather processing, for example. And along the way, we did need to look at that because we were using pig flesh for our testing surface. And so this was one of the questions, right? Does dead pig and live human leave the same use wear pattern? And for my eyes, yes. But
okay.
for another archaeologist with better microscopes, maybe not. Maybe they can differentiate that. A successful tattoo is only going to go in about 2 to 3 millimeters into the skin. And so if you have a tool that has wear patterns 5 millimeters deep on it, God help the person that was tattooed with that, right? If it was. Right. But more likely it wasn't used to tattoo. And so that, I think, is really the big difference. And then there's some really microscopic things where, like with bone tools used on wet hide or fresh hide skin don't have the same patterns of chipping and spalling that happen as a result of working leather. And that, I think, is a result of the tensile strength of the material that they're working.
With what, the tools that they had, I'm assuming, just needles. I saw cactus
spines, yeah.
Cactus spines. There was even, I think, like little bits of copper, sometimes iron, bronze stuff. I'm assuming then that their techniques were just as essentially efficient as ours, and they could get that same level of maybe not as detailed, but pretty detailed and really well done.
I mean, pretty detailed, right? I mean, I'm sure you've seen like the Pazarak tattoos, I mean, they're amazing. And, you look at like the black work on those and how solid those fills are, and consider that, at best someone was working, they may have had a multi-point needle, right? They may have had multiple points bound together, but, they don't have a machine working it. So you're working on this pace of single hand poke, and how long that's going to take to fill in those big black packed areas. And, I think that's part of why you get sort of then into the social realm of the things of like why tattooing has always been this sort of, method of rite of passage or thing that you go through in order to achieve social status, is because it's an undertaking, right? It hurts. You're opening the skin, you're letting blood. All of that is important. But getting back to your question, so yeah, it's, there are a couple of different techniques on the global scale for pre-electrical tattooing, and, they vary pretty widely. The hand tapping from the Pacific Rim is really unique and really strongly correlated with particular geography coming out of Southeast Asia and running out through the Pacific then. Whereas subdermal tattooing, sometimes people call it skin stitching, is one of the methods, is very tightly correlated with living Inuit populations in the circumpolar region, and then maybe also shows up in South America, although we're finding that sort of archaeologically and ethnographically, and so it's not as clear that that's actually happening there.
So clearly we've been tattooing each other for a really long time, but even though it's such a common, universal thing, there's still such a taboo around it where tattooing has been and still is frowned upon by certain groups and societies. My mother is one of these groups, and I can guarantee you that she's probably not even going to be watching this video right now. She doesn't want to see it. You'd almost say there's a stigma around tattooing, which is funny because we get that word from ancient Greek, where it first referred to spots on snakes and then meant the mark of a tattoo, and possibly later as a brand mark on animals or criminals. Which sort of makes sense now that we know that the Greeks saw tattooing as a mark of disgrace. It's just interesting that we use their word for tattoo to describe things that are looked down upon in society. I can see why so many people don't approve of tattoos, because it's literally in the word we use for negative things.
That, I think, is one of the really cool things about that I've learned about in studying tattooing in the past, is how universal it is that, despite our modern biases, despite the fact that your mom and my mom hate our tattoos, right? Despite this, tattoos have been on possibly more bodies, there have possibly been more tattooed people in the past than untattooed people. And, that this is a practice that shows up all over the globe in all different cultures, all different religions. And in the vast majority of them, it's positive. And it's something that's aspired to, and it's a mark of membership. And, it's a connection to the spiritual world and the cosmos, all these things. And, we just come from this very short little span of time in which, people are like, they're for prostitutes and sailors. And
Regardless of the stigma, I'm finally going ahead and getting a tattoo that I've always wanted to celebrate reaching 30,000 subscribers, and I'm taking you with me. This is not my first tattoo. Sorry, Mom, you don't know about the first one, but it is the biggest, and it's the most visible one that I will have. Before we head to the studio, here is the mock-up for you in all of its glory. I'm getting these amazing ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics. It's a segment of a phrase that comes from a Middle Egyptian tomb inscription, and it translates to, "As you love to live and hate to pass on." I first heard this phrase during a lecture in one of my ancient Egyptian religion classes back when I was an undergrad. I actually remember sitting in that lecture hall and seeing it on the PowerPoint screen, and I thought that it was one of the most beautiful things. And actually, I do remember the minute I saw it on that screen, I was like, I'm getting that tattooed on me one day. I'm doing it. And here we are. It's a little late, but we're doing it. I think this phrase not only perfectly encapsulates how the ancient Egyptians viewed life, like you may think that given the way pop culture talks about them, and of course how the archaeological record is skewed, that they were actually obsessed with death. But if you think about it, no one would care that much about their death and their afterlife if they didn't love their lives on Earth as much as they did. It's also a phrase that just really spoke to me. It's a great reminder that the point of my time here is, to live and to have a great time doing it. It's essentially a very fruity version or, long drawn out version of Carpe Diem, but it is my version of Carpe Diem, and now it is going to be on my body forever. I tracked down the original text over the past 10 years and I translated it myself, humble brag. I know, but I needed to make sure that it was the right part of the inscription. I also had the amazing Louise from the Instagram account She Reads Papyri double check my work to make sure I'm not getting, I love soup on my body or some other crazy phrase. So we're all good on that. Take that, seemingly useless archaeology degree. All that money and the countless hours doing my hieroglyphs homework it was finally good for something, let's say, because I don't use it in my daily life, and maybe that's one of my biggest regrets. All right, enough learning. Let's go get me tatted.
Okay. How are you feeling, Raven?
I'm really nervous.
Really nervous?
Can you tell? I just screamed in front of me.
Why are you nervous?
I don't know. It's a big thing. I've wanted it for 10 years. But now it's actually happening, and it's like, oh crap, and it's happening. It's one of those things where it's like, oh yeah, I want a tattoo, in your head, and now it's a reality, and you're just like, oh no, I'm going to be marked for life, as you'd like to say. To get my tattoo, I went to the amazing Cons Thomas at Project London in Hackney. He does super detailed fine line work, and that's exactly what I wanted for this piece. We spent some time getting the stencil absolutely perfect, and then it was time to go under the gun.
How's your tattoo gonna look, Raven?
Like that. Very excited. It's gonna twist, but that's okay. Quick note to anyone getting a tattoo along the outside of their forearm. The pain is fine, but your nerve is gonna pop off. At certain points, it felt like I was continuously hitting my funny bone, hence the weird faces. I was able to nap at some points though, so overall, it was a lovely experience. Finally, it was time to see the finished product. Oh, it looks so cool. Yeah?
Looks awesome.
It looks so good. It looks amazing. Yeah, it's like so perfectly detailed. Yeah, so precise.
Yeah, it's really cool.
Absolutely amazing. All right, so I've had my tattoo for about a week and a half now. Here's what it looks like now. I love it so much. It's had some time to heal, so it looks absolutely fantastic. We also made sure that the spacing of it was so that my watch couldn't come and hit it and it wouldn't rub, and it was just perfectly aligned with my accessories. It is amazing and better than anything I ever could have imagined. So big thank you to Cons for creating such a meaningful piece and fulfilling a 10+ year dream of mine to get this. I'm still getting used to it sort of always being there, like just in passing, like, ah! But I absolutely love it. The best part is that I hit 30,000 subscribers the morning of my appointment, so it was perfectly timed, and I can only thank all of you for that. Thanks so much for sticking around, friends. It really means a lot to me. Here's to the next 30 and beyond. We're gonna get that YouTube plaque. It's gonna happen. I'm gonna make it happen. I just need to finish my book first. Which is also gonna happen. If you haven't already hit that subscribe button, you know what to do. Let's keep this ball rolling. This video really is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the archaeology and the history in general of tattooing. So if you want to learn more, I really recommend that you pick up Ancient Ink. It's absolutely fantastic. It covers all over the world, people and places, and all the evidence that we have for tattooing archaeologically. And if you want more about the history about tattooing and all the social stuff, which is really cool, you find out some really great history and some stories. Definitely pick up Matt Lauder's Painted People. It's another really great book. I've left links to both of these in my description down below, and a lot of other really amazing resources as well. Stay dirty, my friends.